Chas Freeman. He is a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense and former United States Ambassador to Saudi Arabia. He was the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. He was also Charge d'Affaires in Bangkok and Beijing, Acting U.S. Commissioner for Refugee Affairs, and Director of Program Coordination and Development at the U.S. Information Agency. He was also the Principal American Interpreter during the late President Nixon's 1972 opening of U.S. relations with China. And Ambassador Freeman, in that light, I brought my special mug just for the occasion, my Nixon Now cup. So I hope it'll help us in our realist discussion this evening. And of course, our second guest, Douglas Macgregor, very well known to our viewers. He is the former advisor to the Secretary of Defense in President Donald Trump administration. He is a decorated combat veteran, author of 5 books, an all-around great strategic mind. Gentlemen, we were supposed to be joined this evening by editor-in-chief of Do Rzeczy, that is a center-right conservative weekly here in Poland. Unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, Paweł Lisiecki has said he cannot join us this evening, but he does send his regards and promises that he will try and update his knowledge of the current situation in Ukraine by watching this stream. So I think the fundamental question that has to be asked at this point, something that can have a double meaning, and I'd like to direct this first question to Ambassador Freeman. Was this war avoidable, and was this war unprovoked, as we are used to hearing? Ambassador Freeman, take it away.
The war is certainly unnecessary. It was provoked, it is brutal, it is illegitimate, and it has turned into a war of attrition, which at the moment nobody seems to have any great interest in ending. So it is a tragedy for Europe, and it is having huge effects on the global order, most of which are deleterious.
Doug, would you like to? Sorry about that. Yeah, I was on mute. Doug, unprovoked, avoidable. Your thoughts?
No, I think Ambassador Freeman's correct. This was eminently avoidable. But as I'm sure Ambassador Freeman can tell you in greater detail than I, we have a very bad habit of ignoring everyone's interests but our own, and we're not really sure what they are. And so we unfortunately consign responsibility for defining our interests to a small number of people in Washington. And that's what's happened in this particular case. No one in the United States was particularly interested in going to war with anyone, certainly not in backing a war against Russia. But we really didn't give Putin and frankly, his government much choice in the matter. Your viewers are certainly aware of the 14,000 people who died in the intervening 8 years before this intervention by the Russians began. Most of those were people living in Donetsk and Luhansk, and the breakaway republics, as they're called, and they were Russians. In addition to that, you had Russian citizens that were second-class citizens inside Ukraine, and they were being subject to this evil behavior of, we used to call it under the Tsar's Russification, now we call it Ukrainianization. This sort of thing had no future. Putin signed the Minsk agreements, and he was encouraged to believe that the Western powers would exert pressure on the Ukrainians to live up to their end of the bargain. All of that failed. We can go much further back. And of course, the largest issue for the Russians, they're certainly concerned about their citizens, was the emergence of this very large, extremely well-equipped, well-trained, powerful Ukrainian army, whose only rationale for existence was to first smash its way into the so-called breakaway republics and eventually reconquer Crimea. Those things are well known. And in fact, the Russians captured plans to that effect as they advanced into eastern Ukraine. It's tragic, but under those circumstances, if we faced something similar in Mexico, I think that we would have behaved very similarly to the Russians. Probably we would have been much harsher and exercised far less discretion with regard to the use of military power, which is our history. So all in all, it was avoidable. All we had to do was stand up and say, Russia has legitimate security interests in eastern Ukraine. All we had to do was tell Ukraine, its government, we will not support you until you guarantee equal rights for all your citizens before the law. These are not hard things to do, and the State Department likes to blow its horn about its advocacy for human rights. Well, there was an opportunity in Ukraine, and they ignored it completely. So the bottom line is, yes, it was avoidable. Yes, it's a tragedy. And I wish we didn't have it, but we've got it now. And I think it's going to get a lot worse, a lot quicker than people realize.
I want to go back to the few weeks before February 24th, 2022, i.e. in December 2021. We remember that the Russians put out two treaties, draft treaties, one to NATO and one to the United States. Now, I have to tell you, in Eastern Europe, in Poland, the mainstream media, our political elites, everybody interpreted those propositions coming from the Kremlin, which I remember seeing the then United States ambassador coming to the foreign ministry to pick up the draft treaties, to have a look at them. It seems that they were interpreted as unrealistic, although the Russians later claimed that the American response was much more professional than the NATO response. The NATO response was basically apparently very childish. I've seen both responses, and I can testify, I'm pretty sure you gentlemen have seen them also, that the American response was much more mature in its tone, although very unconciliatory in many ways. However, Ambassador Freeman, what's your take on the realism of what the Russians were proposing? Were those positions so unrealistic that we had to go to war in order to show the Russians who's boss? What do you think?
Well, they were in an opening position in a proposed negotiation. Nobody starts a negotiation by coming to their bottom line. Essentially, we now have a situation in which there was a solution to the issue of the Ukrainian civil war, basically. I mean, there are 3 or 4 wars going on. One is among Western Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians and Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the East. Another is between the government in Kyiv and the government of Russia. Yet another is between the United States and Russia. And a fourth is perhaps NATO and Russia. So these are 4 different wars. The Russian proposals, which build on Minsk, the Minsk agreements, which were a proposal to keep the rest of so-called People's Republics in the East within Ukraine and preserve Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity, although with a federal structure that would allow Russian speakers to use their own language and to educate their children in it, in their part of the country. This was, of course, we now know, put forward insincerely by the Germans and the French who negotiated it. So essentially, the United States, stiff-armed, refused a request for a negotiation. And that's the bottom line. Whether the proposal was, quote, realistic or not is beside the point. It was a proposal to talk, and we essentially refused to talk about the European security architecture. Let me make a point about that. I was the person who pieced together various parts of suggestions and ideas from others to put together the idea of the Partnership for Peace within NATO. That was 2 things. First, it was a path to NATO membership that asked those who wish to join NATO to develop the capability to contribute security rather than just consume it. In other words, to master the 3,000 or some portion of the 3,000 STANAGs, as they're called, the standardization agreements, for operational doctrine within NATO so as to become interoperable with other Europeans. And it also asked that those who aspired to membership in NATO conform to European norms of democratic oversight of defense budgets, transparency in their development, and the replacement of the Soviet-style military defense ministers with civilian defense ministers drawn from elections. So this was the proposal. It was a proposal for NATO membership process, but it was also a proposal for a cooperative security system in Europe. Part of it involved a US-NATO Council, which was to give the Russians a role in Europe and to avoid the mistake that Europeans and Americans made after World War I, when instead of following the example of the Congress of Vienna and creating a concert of Europe, we excluded two of the great powers of Europe from any role in its management, Germany and Russia, with disastrous results in World War II. Just one last observation. Doug Macgregor mentioned that and said, and I agree with him, that if anything similar to what we were doing in Ukraine had appeared in Mexico, we would have acted. Actually, we did do that. Most people forget that in the American Civil War, the French took advantage of our internal squabbles to install the Emperor Maximilian in Mexico, of which the only legacy of that is so-called mariachi music, mariachi being the Mexican Spanish pronunciation of mariage, or marriage in French. In any event, the minute our Civil War was over, we massed 40,000 troops on the Mexican border and informed the French that if they didn't leave, we would come after them. The French are smart, and they left, leaving Maximilian to his fate. A couple of years later, Benito Juarez, the great Mexican liberal, executed him with a firing squad. I don't think it's difficult to understand the concerns of the Russians about the placement on their borders and within their traditional cultural area of what is essentially a hostile force. And I think I agree with Doug Macgregor. They basically were left with little choice to react. I think they reacted stupidly and did something that was illegal under international law, and that they could have had alternatives. But they made the decisions they did, and we have to live with the results.
Doug, it seems that, and Ambassador Freeman alluded to this, the security zone, the proximity of foreign forces to your borders, to your country. There seems to be this persuasion among Western elites that Russia, because of its imperial past, is not entitled to a security zone. Russia cannot have a sphere of influence. That is something that is only reserved to Western powers, and especially the United States of America. What's your assessment of this type of thinking, which denies Russia, the basic tenet of any rational foreign and security policy?
Well, first I have to agree with Ambassador Freeman and point out that my Austrian friends are still saddened in disappointment by Maximilian's failure. They thought that they were going to annex Mexico, which would have been a wonderful opportunity for the Austrians, because they probably all would have migrated there in time and there wouldn't be anybody left in Austria. But that's another story.
Doug, instead of drugs, you'd be having more Wiener Schnitzel,
That's right. Now, all kidding aside, I don't think it's a question necessarily of a zone. The real question is, why have we taken this position that Russia is an existential threat to Europe or the United States? I mean, quite frankly, anybody who makes that assertion, it's evidence-free. If you go back and look at February, the first few days of the intervention, then look at what happens from March until about July or August, the Russians sent in very few forces. And several people said, oh, well, look at the Russians. They don't have very many forces, do they? Their army is too small. And they don't seem to be very good. Now, I don't agree with the not very good. I understand the constraints under which they operate, because Putin took the position, we don't want to kill lots of Ukrainians. These are people just like us. We don't want to do a lot of property damage. We want negotiations. And he thought, wrongly obviously, that he could induce negotiations. Nobody was interested in talking. We don't need to go back over that ground. But that's the first thing. Is it because Russia doesn't qualify as a pristine liberal democracy? Well, if that's the standard, then Ukraine fails miserably and is worse now than it's ever been. Is it because Russia is too corrupt? Well, we've got lots of corruption in lots of countries, even in our own. This is nonsense. So where is the justification for treating Russia in this way? And then secondly, what are Russia's legitimate security interests? And I think you've stated them. They deserve to have a border area or neighbors that are not necessarily postured, organized, and equipped to attack them. That's not unreasonable. And the funny thing is, when all of this began, my friends that I served with at NATO all took the position that neutrality for Ukraine was a gift to the Russians and to Europe. What a wonderful thing. A nice, open, secure country that is neutral, where we can do business, where no one is threatened. The Russians feel safe from us. We feel safe from the Russians. What's the problem? But we know that that was rejected out of hand. And as the ambassador pointed out, there has been no diplomacy. Whatever the Russians have said, we've dismissed out of hand. When anyone in their right mind would have taken whatever offer was there and said, thank you very much. On closer inspection, we see some good things. We need time to study it. In the meantime, while we study this, we'd also like to arrange talks. And then you do your horse trading or your discussion privately. There's too much public diplomacy because every congressman, every president wants to stand there, hurl abuse at the foreign enemy or alleged enemy, and somehow or another think he's going to endear himself to the American public. And here's the news. Most Americans could care less what happens in Ukraine. That's the sad truth.
Well, in light of this, and because of Ukraine, the president of the United States was in Ukraine and in Poland, just left a few hours ago, actually, on Air Force One. I want to touch upon my country, Poland's role in this entire conflagration, which has been very important because during the last 48 hours, we've been hearing a lot of commentary coming from people who are very critical, by myself being one of them, of the current government's position that Poland is becoming the second proxy vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine, in the sense that whereas the main thrust of the proxy war, which has been acknowledged by all the major players that it is a proxy war, is Ukraine, that Poland is lining up to be proxy number two. And in light of this, I picked up this quote from the late Edward Gierek, who was the head of the Polish United Workers' Party in the late 70s. So this is a man who dealt with three presidents, in essence, President Nixon, President Ford, and President Carter towards the end of the 70s. He actually hosted President Nixon in 72, just after the visit in China. I think it was 2 months after, in June of 1972. And Gierek, in an interview in 1992, when asked about how newly reborn Poland should deal with the United States, stated the following, I quote, "Believe me, I have talked to 3 American presidents, and I know that for them, we are just pawns on the grand chessboard of world politics." Fairly controversial statement, but I'd like to get both of your thoughts, gentlemen, on that perspective in light of Poland's role in the current proxy war with Russia. Ambassador Freeman.
Well, certainly if the war spills out over the Ukrainian borders, Poland is the most likely place for it to spill out. That is clear. And it is very appropriate for the government of Poland to be a bit cautious about that. I think there's an issue, a couple of issues I'd like to speak to, which bear on this, if I may. One is geography. If you're Russian, or for that matter, a Pole, you are a prisoner of geography. There's nothing between Moscow and the Pyrenees except plains that are easily crossed by cavalry or modern equipment. There's nothing between Moscow and Kamchatka except frozen plains. If you're sitting in Moscow, or you're sitting in Warsaw, or in Berlin, you don't have any natural defenses of a geographic nature. And therefore, you have to be concerned about the orientation and alignment of your neighbors. You know, there have been multiple instances of invasion of Russia, both by the Mongols, by the French, by the Germans, and so forth and so on. So there's a perfectly rational basis for Russian concern about denying Ukraine to NATO, which, after all, was, during the Cold War, a defensive alliance, but after the Cold War mounted several offensive operations, obviously in the former Yugoslavia, but also in Afghanistan and Libya. So I think the concerns that Poles have and Russians have a rational basis and need to be taken into account. A second comment is about spheres of influence. Rather than Russia trying to incorporate Ukraine into a Russian sphere of influence, I think it was attempting strategic denial. It did not want Ukraine incorporated into the US sphere of influence known as NATO. And I think that's very clear. Spheres of influence may be objectionable to us, except in the Western Hemisphere, where we have always asserted a sphere of influence. But the fact is that attempting to deny other countries spheres of influence in a global order that is increasingly disorderly and multipolar is not going to work. Therefore, I think, and I should say, by way of advertising, there's a new handbook of diplomacy out in which I have a chapter on spheres of influence, which are a very interesting diplomatic tool, not much examined. So I think the geography dictates caution on the part of those countries that don't have natural geographic defenses. And it also dictates caution on the part of those who would place forces next to them that threaten them. I think Poland is in a very awkward position. It always has been. I'm delighted as the father-in-law of a couple of Polish Americans that Poland is back as a great power in Europe. But I think it does need to be very cautious in this context.
Doug, your thoughts?
Well, the Poles are a charming group of people. They have a wonderful history, but much like Americans, they have difficulty learning from it. And Ambassador Freeman has pointed to the singular reality that however great Poland may be, whatever its aspirations are, it is, for better or worse, wedged between two great powers, really great powers, Germany and Russia. Germany and Russia have lots of reasons to cooperate, but that doesn't mean that Germany or Russia necessarily have any interest in capturing, conquering, and administering Polish territory. And I think people need to get that through their heads. I see no evidence that Putin wants anything to do with Western Ukraine. I mean, he feels compelled to do what he's done in the East. He may ultimately, and I think he probably will, his forces will take all of Eastern Ukraine as a security measure in all probability. But there's no interest in Western Ukraine. If you're a Russian, do you really want to manage lots of Western Ukrainians that hate your guts? That's a very unrewarding exercise. Do the Russians want to manage Poles? Do the Germans want to manage Poles? The answer is no and no. So let's put this 19th century imperialist thinking to bed. Stop talking about Europe as a chessboard. Then let's ask a couple of very key questions. I never hear anybody say this. What do the Ukrainians want? Have they held a referendum in that country? Did everyone stand up and say, yes, we want war with Russia? I would tell you that if you go back to Zelensky's election, when he ran on a peace platform, he was elected overwhelmingly by the population of Ukraine, including not all, but a substantial portion of Western Ukrainians, because they, as well as the Ukrainians in the East, wanted the same thing. They wanted peace. They didn't want revenge. They didn't want a revanchist war to retake Crimea. They wanted peace. Peace is essential to prosperity. So I think we can say safely no one has really addressed that question. What is in the interest of the people that live in the country? And that applies to Poland. What do the Poles want? Has anybody asked them? You've got a government right now that is extraordinarily hostile to Russia and seems hell-bent for some sort of confrontation. That's catastrophic in my view, and it's unnecessary. So what do the Poles want? Somewhere along the line, people have to ask that question, and the Poles need to answer. So do the Ukrainians. It's a little late for Ukraine, tragically, as we know. There may be only 18 to 22 million Ukrainians left in the country at this point, and everyone who's come out says they will never go back. It's tragic. I don't know that Ukraine will even exist as a nation state when this is over, regardless of what peace arrangements are made. Who knows? But we don't want that fate to befall Poland. So I hope that someone in Poland will stand up and say, what do the Polish people want? Let's find out. Maybe they don't like the answer, but I suspect it will be peace and prosperity, not war with Russia.
Indeed.
I think we need to,
Go ahead, Ambassador.
if I may come in
Yep.
on this, I think we need to recognize that one way or another, Ukraine has been effectively partitioned. That Crimea is not coming back under any circumstances. And the Donbass is also, I think, lost to Ukraine. But we have to ask ourselves a couple of questions. What will be left of Ukraine? Will it be viable? This gets to the loss of population, the fact that the major industries have been in the east, the fact that huge damage has been done to the country. I think people are dreaming if they think the European Union is going to come up with the money to repair all of that damage. But we don't know whether at the end of this, Odessa will be, you have to get a Russian or a Ukrainian visa to go there. We don't know. And so one question is, when this is over, however it ends, how does the Ukraine survive? That's pretty important to Poland, among other countries. The second question is, what sort of European security architecture do we anticipate? Is it one which is where Russia sits on one side of a DMZ, like in Korea, and the rest of Europe sits on the other side? Or is it something like what we envisaged in the Partnership for Peace, where, by the way, the working assumption was that the Ukrainians would be too smart to want to join NATO, because that would be such a provocation to Russia that it would have dire consequences, but that they would want to become militarily interoperable with NATO through the Partnership for Peace in case of some contingency. Everybody saw Ukraine as a buffer and a bridge between Russia and the rest of Europe. And the fact that it chose a different course under urging from successive American presidents is tragic. Joe Biden, who just visited Warsaw right before this war, said, I don't do red lines. I don't respect anybody's red lines. Well, that is pretty foolish. And we've seen the result of that. We now have people in our government, Victoria Nuland, for example, saying that the war must go on until Ukraine recovers Crimea. Well, when pigs fly, that will happen.
Just in line of those observations, I think in terms of the Polish government, the problem is the uncompromising view in a way is Victoria Nuland on steroids in a sense, because the message coming from both the presidential palace and the government and the prime minister is that Russia has to be completely defeated, an uncompromising total defeat. And the way they're framing the situation is that if Russia is not defeated, that would mean the end of European civilization, the end of the liberal West, and so on and so on. How they arrive at that conclusion is anyone's guess, but these are things not even, Jake Sullivan, Anthony Blinken, Victoria Nuland are saying, and in essence, these are the people that Poland is hinging our foreign policy directives on. I mean, those three people, basically, unless we believe in the fact, or non-fact rather, that President Biden has a firm hold on his foreign policy and his foreign policy team. So the sort of the strategic implications of what's been going on since February 2022 is the Americans say one thing and the Poles take it to the next level in a way. So we're sort of like the Rottweiler, the American Rottweiler here in Eastern Europe, being pulled back sometimes by the Americans, as was the case in the first couple of weeks when we proposed to give those MiG-29s to Ukraine. But, Anthony Blinken even stepped in and said, wait, that's going a little bit too far. We don't want World War III here. Now they're openly talking about it. So I don't know whether we're having an influence, but it's definitely a negative influence, or the tendency is such that, you radicalize over time. But in light of the speech that President Biden delivered last night in Poland, he continues to mention the world. The world is united against this aggression. Now, obviously, he seems to forget that the world also includes China, the Middle East, India. Ambassador Freeman, I'd like to pose this question again to you. China and the Middle East have been positioning themselves, or there's this expectation that they might be mediators in a peace proposal. Anthony Blinken was in Egypt a few weeks ago. They discussed the potential for restarting nuclear arms agreements with the Russians. We have the Russian response already. Actually, we got one yesterday. President Putin has suspended Russian participation in the START treaty. What do you think the Middle East countries and China can bring to the negotiating table and potentially resolving this war as soon as possible?
India, China, Brazil, other countries in Africa and Latin America, and the Arabs all want a multipolar world order. If Russia is humiliated and weakened, that order will not happen. What we will have is some sort of quasi-bipolar order between China and the United States. Nobody wants that. Therefore, when we say, that we must weaken and isolate Russia, there is people in the global south, as it were, outside Europe, beyond the G7, which is the club of former imperialist powers, all react negatively. That has no appeal at all. What they want is peace. They want access to Russian and Ukrainian resources, and they want Europeans to be able to devote their money to something other than fighting each other. Now, at the end of the week, probably on Friday, General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, will probably deliver a peace proposal. The danger is that will be rejected out of hand by the United States and others simply because it's Chinese. Well, how can a country that, quote, aligns itself with Russia possibly mediate? Well, the answer is, first of all, China has been very careful not to align itself with Russia, but it has not aligned itself with the United States either. In fact, the Indians are more pro-Russian than the Chinese. Yeah. All the polling shows. So this is complicated. But it is not true that a mediator with a bit of sympathy for one side, and the Chinese do sympathize with the Russian view that they were pushed into this by NATO enlargement and the refusal by NATO and the United States to negotiate. It is not true that someone with that sympathy cannot mediate. I helped when I was on active duty in the U.S. Foreign Service. I helped to broker the withdrawal of Cuban forces from Angola, the independence of Namibia, the withdrawal of South African forces from Namibia,